Okay, hello everyone. This is the second lecture for the legislative branch, and we are going to begin right where we left off, which was with the legislative process. So, just real quickly to begin, what you guys will hopefully soon recognize with the legislative process is that it is cumbersome, it is tedious, it is long, it is difficult, and oftentimes, in fact, the overwhelming majority of the times, the process ends in failure. Most bills do not become a law. Every single step of the process is just another opportunity for a bill to die in committee or not pass a chamber. It's important to realize, though, that the reason why it is such a cumbersome and difficult process is because the goal is for there to be a significant amount of deliberation so that if there are any shortcomings in a bill or if there's anything that hasn't been thought out, this is something that you want to try and avoid. And the more you discuss and deliberate something, the more likely you are to come to a more reasonable conclusion. And so the reason why we have this process is to negate the chances of passing anything that would become a law that is in fact harmful for our society. So the first step is that a bill must be introduced. It can only be introduced by a member of the chamber. So bills can only be introduced by a congressman or congresswoman or a senator. Although even though only a senator or a representative can introduce a bill, there's various other different players that are involved, such as interest groups, lobbyist groups. Constituents can put pressure on members of Congress, and then especially the President of the United States oftentimes has a significant amount of influence as to at least a specific bill that can be passed. And this is what we saw with Obamacare, the Civil Rights Act, and the Voting Rights Act, and the Trump tax cut. So all three of those pieces, or excuse me, four of those pieces of legislation, Obamacare, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Trump tax cut, all of them are passed by Congress, and eventually signed by the president. But the president for each of those respective bills, so Obama for Obamacare, Johnson for the Civil Rights and Voting Act, or Voting Rights Act, and then Trump for the tax cut, the presidents all played a significant role in getting that legislation passed. So, although only members of Congress can introduce a bill, there's a lot of different other entities that play a part in influencing members of Congress to introduce a bill. So after it gets introduced to the chamber, it then has to go to a committee or several committees, depending on how big and complex the bill is. If it goes to several committees, before it can move on to that next step of moving on to the floor, every committee has to agree on the exact same language in the bill. So if a committee during a markup session wants to add an amendment, before it can reach the floor, any addition or repealing of an amendment of the bill has to pass through every single committee that the bill is given out to, and every single committee has to agree on all of those changes before it can move on to the floor. So after all the committees or the single committee agree on the bill, the language of the bill, it then goes to the floor. If it passes so the floor is the entire chamber. So the floor of the House would be every representative in the House. The floor in the Senate would be every senator. So once it reaches the floor, oops, 1 second. Okay, excuse me. Here's where we were. Sorry about that. So once it reaches the floor, and let's say it passes the chamber. So let's say it passes the House or it passes the Senate. It then moves to the opposite chamber. So if it passes the House, it then moves on to the Senate. If it passes the Senate, it then moves on to the House. And once it moves to that opposite chamber, It then goes back to the beginning of the process. It gets introduced. It then goes through the committees of the opposite chamber, goes to the floor of the opposite chamber. And once again, if there are any amendments added or anything repealed, once it passes, if it passes the opposite chamber, it then has to go back to the original chamber, and there has to be agreement on that bill. So let's say it passes everything, both chambers, the House and the Senate both agree on the exact language of the bill. It then goes to the president, who can either veto the bill, which means it gets sent back to Congress. And oftentimes when this happens, the bill is considered dead. It's usually Congress oftentimes does not have the ability. It does have the authority, but it oftentimes does not have the ability to override a president's veto, because instead of a simple majority, it requires 2/3 of both chambers of Congress, which is a pretty difficult number to achieve. So if the president vetoes it, it goes back to Congress, where it's usually dead, but it can turn into a law with the 2/3 votes by both chambers. If the president signs the bill, then it does become a law. But like I said earlier, and as we've been going through this process, you guys can see how difficult it is. And so that's why the overwhelming majority of bills do not become a law. So the reason why members introduce a bill is for various different reasons. It can be to placate an interest group. It can be because constituents are continuously bringing up an issue to a representative or to a senator. It's to draw attention to a problem or to propose an innovative solution to a problem. So oftentimes, for example, after mass shootings, we oftentimes see bills being introduced with gun legislation. And in the wake of 9/11 as well, there were a lot of bills introduced and quite a few that were passed and signed into law that deal with, for example, airport security. So oftentimes when there's a tragic event or a crisis that occurs, you oftentimes see bills being passed pretty quickly in response to that crisis. So referral to a committee. So once again, after a bill is introduced by a member of the chamber, it then moves on to a committee or subcommittee. It must pass through the committee or committees if it's gone out to several bills before it can reach the floor of the chamber. Committees then hold hearings to gather information. So, for example, with Obamacare, there were plenty of hearings from public health experts, from doctors, from nurses, insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies. So the goal of this and all these hearings is, once again, to deliberate the bill as much as possible and to try and get the perspective from as many viewpoints that you can from all the entities that are going to be impacted by this bill. So you could also get testimony from healthcare patients, so just regular citizens who have maybe issues with their insurance would give testimony at the Obamacare hearings. Additionally, the hearings are to collect and analyze data. So once again, gain more information about the effects of the bill before making a decision on it. Unfortunately, a trend that we have been seeing since around the mid-70s is that the amount of hearings that are occurring is decreasing. So Congress is spending less and less time since about the 70s deliberating and discussing bills. So, for example, perhaps the most notorious recent instant of Congress basically bypassing the bypassing committees and hearings and testimony would be in 2017. The Republican-controlled Congress tried to repeal Obamacare, and they actually had the amount of votes needed to repeal it. It ended up not passing. So the repeal of Obamacare ended up not passing because a Republican senator named John McCain, who's recently passed away, from Arizona, he really took seriously the deliberative practice of the Senate. Oftentimes, the Senate is referred to as the greatest deliberative body in the world. That's where the most intense deliberations occur. And because the process had been so skipped and bypassed, and it was really rushed and hurried. Even though John McCain did not agree and did not agree with Obamacare, he ended up voting no to repeal Obamacare simply on the principle that it had not been deliberated to the extent needed, or that to the extent that historically Congress has done. So after the committees and the hearings, there is the markup session, like I had mentioned earlier. And so a markup session allows members to make changes to a bill. But remember, every time there is a markup session and any amendment is added or repealed, it has to be voted on by other committees, and they all have to agree on the same language. Whenever there's a change made, it has to be entirely agreed upon, which once again is why it's so difficult to get something passed. There is also a committee report that is produced at the end by the committees. So the committee report deals with information on the bill from the committee to the floor. So it's to inform the rest of the chamber what the bill is, what the problem is, what the potential solution is. It also offers estimates of cost, so the fiscal impact of the bill and the intent of the bill. Whenever a bill gets held up in a committee, which is oftentimes, sometimes it's done intentionally, there is something called a discharge petition, where a member of maybe it's not even of the committee, so some member of Congress that's not even a part of the committee can introduce a discharge petition in the House of Representatives to basically get it out of committee and move it to the floor immediately for a vote. But those are really rarely used. So floor consideration in the House. So once it is introduced to the House, it goes to the committees, and once it passes the committees, it then moves on to the House. There is a really powerful force called the House Rules Committee, and what their responsibility is, or what they have authority over, is they get to determine when a bill will be subject to debate. They get to determine how long the bill will be up for debate, and they also get to determine if there are going to be markup sessions. So if there is going to even be allowed any changes to a bill. The committee whole is so it's a little confusing, but although it's the committee whole, so it means it's for the whole House of Representatives. This is typically you need over half of the representatives present on the floor in order to conduct business or to conduct quorum. But the committee whole, or the committee of the whole, although it consists of all members, it's governed by different rules. And so one of the different rules that it is governed by is that it only requires 100 representatives out of the 435. So it's essentially an exception to the normal rules in order to make it easier to get a complex or a contentious issue passed. So once it passes the House, it then moves on to the Senate. So the rules with senators are a little bit different than in the House of Representatives. Individual senators actually have quite a bit of power vested in them to where they can stop a bill by themselves, whereas members of the House of Representatives do not have some of these powers. So some of the tactics or strategies that senators have power over is basically delaying a bill or putting a hold on a bill if they object to it. And so the most common form of this is referred to as a filibuster. And a filibuster is a tactic to delay or postpone action. And basically, the rule is that you just cannot stop talking and you have to be present at the floor. So we've had filibusters that have gone for 24 hours. And once again, the only rule is you cannot stop talking and you cannot leave the floor. You cannot leave the podium. And so we've had examples of, I think the most notorious example of the filibuster was during the Civil Rights Act, when that was in the Senate. A Democratic senator from the South who did not want the Civil Rights Act to pass gave a filibuster for over 24 hours. And he just read foundational documents of the U.S. He then read, I think it was the election voting laws of every state. He then read Supreme Court decisions. So like I said, you can literally read anything. Ted Cruz, a senator from Texas, during the Obamacare hearings, gave a filibuster for 23 hours where he was reading Green Eggs and Ham by Dr. Seuss. So like I said, you can just literally don't stop talking. As long as you don't stop talking, you can filibuster a bill until it basically gets to the point to where the Speaker of the Senate says, you know what, we're adjourned for today. We're not going to vote on this today. However, if there is a supermajority, so if a party has 60 senators, then there is enough votes to produce something called a cloture. And so it's a procedure which can end a filibuster, but it requires 60 votes. So for example, let's say the Democrats win the 2 Georgia Senate runoff races in January next month, which I don't think they will do, by the way. But let's just say for this theoretical situation that they do. The Senate would then be basically tied at 50-50. And the way that a tie is broken in the Senate is that the vice president gets to cast the deciding vote. And so obviously, with the incoming Democratic administration, if it's tied 50-50, the Vice President, Kamala Harris, would vote for the Democrats and cast the deciding vote. However, what they cannot stop, because it's only 50-50 and not 60-40, is a filibuster. So a Republican senator, if they don't want a piece of legislation passed, they can deploy the filibuster to stop that legislation, even though they are not in the majority. So once again, you could have theoretically 59 senators agreeing on something, and then one senator from Wyoming, a really small state, basically hold up the entire Senate. So the power that is given to individual senators is quite large, and there's nothing like it really in the House. Lastly, there's something referred to as the nuclear option, which is it basically allows the majority party to bypass the regular rules of the Senate. So, for example, if there is a majority, but it's only 52 or 53 or anywhere from 51 to 59, and you do not have the votes to produce a cloture and end the filibuster, you can employ the nuclear option, which is basically bypassing of a Senate rule. So you can bypass the 60 votes requirement and say we only need a simple majority. And that is one way to get around the filibuster as well, besides the cloture. However, the nuclear option is not used very often. It's something that senators typically try and stay away from, except in extreme circumstances. So here's a graphic that basically shows the process that I've been talking about. So there's an idea, or for whatever reason, we've talked about other interest groups as well, come up with an idea or a reason as to introduce a bill, which can either go to the Senate or the House of Representatives. So once it is introduced to the chamber, it then goes on to a committee or several committees. Once it passes those committees, if it does pass those committees, which is a difficult process in and of itself, it then goes to the floor of that chamber. If it passes the floor, it restarts and it goes to the opposite chamber, and the whole process starts over. It then goes from the Senate to the respective committee in the Senate. If it passes the committees, it goes to the floor of the Senate. And then if there are any changes made, but it passes, it still has to go back because now it's not the same bill. And so there's this step in here, which is oftentimes this is where you get the conference, a conference committee. And so this is one of the committees that we covered in lecture 1. A conference committee is a committee with representatives of both the Senate and the House of Representatives in order to reconcile the differences between the bills. So, but let's say it passes the House, then it passes the Senate, they reconcile their differences. So after it has passed both chambers and both chambers vote yes on the exact same bill, it then goes to the President of the United States. And if the president signs it, the bill then becomes a law. If the president vetoes it, it's most likely going to die. It'll be sent back to Congress, but oftentimes it's just seen as a dead bill. However, it is possible, if the president vetoes it, that Congress has a 2/3 majority, and they can override the presidential veto, and it becomes a law. But normally that does not happen. So problems of partisanship. So there has always been partisanship in the United States, but a trend that has really that we've seen over the past couple of decades is that the partisanship is increasing. Members of Congress are less and less willing to work with the other side or to work with the other party. It's not really just Congress. You can see this in the general population as well. Just to give you guys an example, in 2009, when Obama's first day in office, Republican Mitch McConnell, who is currently the Speaker of the Senate, he said, "My goal or our job is to make sure that Obama is a one-term president." So there was no indication of being willing to work with the other side. And largely what we saw during Obama's presidency is that the Republicans um, almost unanimously refused to work with the Democrats on any type of legislation, which is really unfortunate because although there are always going to be differences, there are always some things that both Republicans and Democrats can agree on. And so even if you cannot agree on 90% of policy, the 10% that you can agree on, or the 5% that you can agree on, can you work with the other side to get something passed? And so, for example, Senator Bernie Sanders, who is very progressive, he's really far on the left, and that senator I had referenced earlier, John McCain, who was a Republican, politically, they are very different or were very different. But they both worked together with each other on a bill for veterans. And so once again, that's an example. You have people who are from really far ends of the political spectrum who are willing to work with each other. And that's something that we're not seeing as much anymore. Currently, with the new president-elect Joe Biden from the Democratic Party, he is in the process of making his cabinet right now. And he has said this in the campaign trail, and he said this after he won the election. He said, "I want my cabinet to represent what America looks like." And part of what he wants to do, or what has been floated, he's been asked, "Would you be willing to appoint a Republican to your cabinet?" And he said, "Yes, I would be willing to do that," which is something that is not typically done. And from the elements of the left wing of the Democratic Party are basically telling him, "No, don't do that. Don't work with the Republicans." They're saying they didn't work with us, so we don't need to work with them. So unfortunately, we're really polarized right now. Um, and it's not good for a democracy. And so you can see that it's really represented in this graph. And so when there's this unwillingness to work with the other side, it's referred to as gridlock, which is a slowdown or a halt in Congress's ability to legislate. And it becomes even more common in a divided government. And so, as you can see, the amount of bills over the decades is declining, and Congress is getting less and less done, which is why so many people get angry with the government and think, why don't they do anything? Why don't they do much? Well, it's because, unfortunately, Congress, as well as the general population, is becoming quite polarized. So this is a graphic that's kind of difficult to see on the PowerPoint, so I'm going to expand it here. And so what this is, what you see here, right here, it says 1949. Down here, it's 2011. So what this is, the blue dots represent the Democrats, the red dots represent the Republicans, and these lines that you see going in between is efforts by those members of Congress reaching out and working with the other side. So working across the aisle, reaching across the aisle, as it is called. And as you can see, for decades, there was this reaching across the aisle. This is just normal that you worked with the other side. And then really starting kind of in the 90s, it really dissipates. And I mean, the latest point in this graph is 2011, but over the last 10 years, it has not gotten any better. And so as you can see, in 2011, only a couple of Democrats were willing to kind of work across the aisle, and hardly, in fact, maybe I don't see any Republicans that were willing to reach across the aisle. And so this graph really depicts how we have become polarized. We're moving further to, if you're liberals, have moved further left, conservatives have moved further right, and not only are they moving further away from each other, they're also less willing to work with each other. And so this is why we get this gridlock that we see. So congressional powers expressed in Article 1, Section 8. So hopefully this looks familiar to you guys. This is from the Constitution. And so these are all of the delegated powers to Congress. And the most important one that I want to talk about is the 18th. It's referred to as the Necessary and Proper Clause, or also the Elastic Clause. And so what this 18th delegated responsibility is, or the 18th clause, is to make all laws necessary and proper to the execution of any of the other express powers. So what that means is that the Congress can pass any law that they find necessary and proper in order to uphold all of these delegated previous responsibilities. So like I said, the necessary and proper clause gives Congress the power to make laws necessary and proper to carry out the delegated duties. So the reason why it's referred to as the necessary and proper or elastic clause, like I said, is because it gives Congress really broad and general powers, which means it's a really flexible clause that power has. It makes it really expansive. What is necessary and proper? This is why some of the pieces of legislation that are passed by Congress are so contentious. And whereas some entities may believe that Congress does have the right to do that because they see it as necessary and proper, whereas other entities may argue that no, that law is not necessary and proper. So it's really vague and unambiguous, and it was intentionally left that way by the authors of the Constitution. And the reason why is because they knew that they couldn't foresee all of the problems. And so if they only explicitly gave Congress those first 17, if there was a crisis that came up that Congress didn't have the ability to deal with it, that would be a problem. So in order to overcome the problem of not being able to foresee all of the potential problems in the future for the United States, that's why they wrote that law, or that clause, so in such a vague manner, so that you can pass legislation and you have a really broad range of arguments as to why it is necessary and proper to carry out the delegated powers. So that is the end of the lecture.